Hello and welcome back to Root of Ramose, a poetry writing series in which we aim to improve our verse by observing the mechanics, aesthetics, and meaning of the Western poetic tradition. Today I am taking a break from analyzing the Epic of Gilgamesh so that we can go over how to craft rhythm and flow in lines of verse. I think you'll find that this is a very important topic to cover and to really understand as a writer. So this particular subject will have two parts. In today's video, we'll be covering how choices we make with the line will have certain impacts on the expression of a given line. And then with the second video for this particular subject, we'll take a closer look at the construction of lines as far as how the pattern of stressed versus unstressed syllables operates within the line of poetry. Originally, I did want all of the information put together in one video, but I felt as though it would have been too long of a video to cover all of that information, and I didn't want everything that I talk about to be too overwhelming. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know. So, first off, why bother? Isn't everything in blank verse now? Haven't we been liberated from the archaic constraints of form and structure? Even if you are someone that doesn't adhere to form and isn't aware of structure, it doesn't mean that those aspects of your writing goes away or is no longer relevant. Form and structure is still there, even if you don't realize it. While you may assume that poetic structure is something that only is observable when viewed on the page, that couldn't be further from the truth. How we phrase ideas and how we incorporate punctuation as space has a dramatic impact on the sound, feeling, and meaning of your lines. The relationship between sound and space, between words and even syllables, is what creates what we could refer to as the song of the line. This is otherwise known as rhythm and pacing. Building sonic harmony or dissonance is what makes language beautiful or ugly. And the structure and timing of your lines is what creates the intended emotional impact in your poetry. So now that we understand why structure and form is so important in our writing, we're going to look at a poem and see how the writer crafts their lines. We're going to then see how those lines serve to display meaning, and then finally how the structure's meaning invokes an emotional response from the reader. The poem that I've selected for today's study is Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines by Dylan Thomas. So first I'll do a complete reading of the poem. Next I'll briefly address the subject matter, and then finally I'll discuss how the lines are constructed to communicate both meaning and emotion. Light breaks where no sun shines, where no sea runs, the waters of the heart push in their tides, and, broken ghosts with glowworms in their heads, the things of light file through the flesh where no flesh decks the bones. A candle in the thighs warms youth and seed and burns the seeds of age. Where no seed stirs, the fruit of man unwrinkles in the stars, bright as a fig. Where no wax is, the candle shows its hairs. Dawn breaks behind the eyes. From poles of skull and toe the windy blood slides like a sea. Nor fenced, nor staked, the gushers of the sky spout to the rod, divining in a smile the oil of tears. Night in the sockets rounds, like some pitch moon, the limit of the globes. Day lights the bone. Where no cold is, the skinning gales unpin the winter's robes. The film of spring is hanging from the lids. Light breaks on secret lots, on tips of thought where thoughts smell in the rain, where logics die. The secret of the soil grows through the eye, and blood jumps in the sun. Above the waste allotments the dawn halts. So this poem establishes its meaning through a very heavy use of figurative language and metaphor. To me, I believe that this poem is illustrating the enduring will of the human spirit, that out of misery there is hope, even out of emptiness there is a strength that we have that allows us to continue moving forward. In many cases, this poem is creating meaning by describing a place of absence or darkness that is still miraculously capable of generating light and life. Looking at the first stanza, the poem establishes its subject matter. Light breaks where no sun shines. We know that this isn't a literal statement, this is a metaphor, and it is suggesting that even when there is darkness, there is still some kind of light. Where no sea runs, the waters of the heart push in their tides. This adds to the previous notion captured, suggesting that the light that was previously referenced is connected to the waters of the heart, not from an external source, but from the interior of the individual. And broken ghosts with glowworms in their heads, the things of light, file through the flesh where no flesh decks the bone. This use of figurative language again deepens our understanding of what the speaker is alluding to with the light and waters of the heart. Here the speaker is illustrating the quality of the light, that it is broken and incomplete, but reaffirming that it is still light, even if it is imperfect. The mention of glowworms in their heads could be seen as a sly hint at death, and I say that because the image in that particular line isn't being used to talk explicitly about death, but death is present, and it is a component of what is being said, but that image is quickly compounded by the next two lines in order to talk about light and life. The last line suggests that hope is able to add to our being and protect us in a way that seems impossible. So now that we have an idea of the subject matter that we're dealing with in this poem, we can look at how the lines are constructed to create meaning and emotion. So, just looking at the lines, we see that there is an alternating pattern of shorter and longer lines, which is an interesting feature of this poem and actually is the reason why I selected this particular poem for our study for today. Generally, the rule of thumb with line length is that when we are working with longer lines, this is meant to invoke a sense of contemplation. You're trying to give the reader space so that they can really soak in the imagery and meaning of the line before they have to move their eyes visually to the next line on the page. When we use consecutively short lines, this creates a sense of quickness or anxiety for the reader because of how often they have to be moving their eyes to the next line in order to take in more information. So with this poem that we're looking at today, the line lengths are alternating between short and long. Visually, this is providing a kind of ebb and flow in both our attention to the imagery as well as how we feel about a given line. This alternating line length is also reflecting the nature of the subject matter, suggesting that the ebb and flow of hope and hardship follows us to the very end. So now that we've taken a look at how line length impacts the reader emotionally, we're going to take a look at punctuation and see how it's used to create space and pacing for the poem. Punctuation and how lines are separated is how we create both sonic and visual space in our poetry. Let's take a look and see how we can further develop meaning through space. So a line break is straightforward. It's where we take verse and break it into a new line. So with this poem, these are the line breaks. So line breaks can occur in a few different conditions, but today I'm just going to go over end stops and enjambment. An end stop occurs when either a line breaks with punctuation at the end of the line, or a complete thought or image has been provided within that line, so it's contained in that one single line. On the other hand, an enjambment occurs when the line breaks without the use of punctuation at the end and before a complete thought or image has been expressed in that line. Now, the interesting thing with enjambment is that it helps to create compound meaning in your lines. So a solitary line that is enjambed will contain its own image and meaning that exists in isolation, while also expressing a different and or expanded expression given the context of the continuing line. So let's look at a few examples of enjambment in our poem. Where no sea runs, the waters of the heart push in their tides. From poles of skull and toe, the windy blood slides like a sea. Where no cold is, the skinning gales unpin the winter's robes. Notice as I was reading how I didn't stop at the end of the lines that were enjambed. I kept going. And this is a really great time to mention that when you're reading a poem with enjambment, as in poetry that has lines that end without punctuation, that we should read it with a pause that's equivalent to, at most, half the length of a comma. If you're putting too much of a pause, you're reading it like it's end-stopped, not enjambed. And the only time that this wouldn't be the case is if you're dealing with a poem that doesn't use any punctuation at all. In that case, the use of the line break would be the means by which to simulate punctuation, and is the way to signal to the reader to pause at the end of the line. That's really the only scenario. Again, when the poem is using punctuation, don't add too much of a pause when the line is enjambed, because ultimately then you're cutting up the poem's meaning and imagery in a way that wasn't intended when read in its entirety. As I said earlier, when there is an enjambment connecting two lines, each line can have its own individual expression while simultaneously working together in order to create a different, unexpected meaning or a more expanded expression of the subject matter. So with these lines in particular, the meaning of the line is always incomplete and then quickly clarified by the following line. The first line in each of these examples is always abstract and surreal, with phrases like waters of the heart, windy blood, skinning gales unpin. The fact that the writer is choosing to end lines with these uncertain images is intentional, and that they are resolving so quickly and simply with short lines, again, reveals the overall subject matter of the ebb and flow, clarity and obscurity, light and dark. So it all comes together and is very harmonious, the choices that are being made with the lines. So in a moment, we're going to look at what would happen if the lines of this poem were constructed differently. But before I get to that, I need to talk about one last component of structure and pacing, which would be the use of punctuation in lines of verse. So when punctuation occurs anywhere on a line of verse, this is referred to as a caesura. Whether it is a comma, a period, a semicolon, the em dash, my sweet mistress, all of these are examples of caesura. So we should consider the caesura as a pause or rest within the line. Caesuras can occur towards the beginning of the line, in the middle, or towards the end of the line, and can be more specifically referred to as an initial, medial, or terminal caesura. The nature of a given caesura in a line of verse can be even further categorized as either masculine or feminine, and we will go over that when we identify stressed versus unstressed syllables in part 2, the next video about this subject. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of caesura. Here we have an end stop, and then we have and, comma, broken ghosts with glowworms in their heads, end stop. This is very unusual, as it is the only time the speaker is using an initial caesura, as in a caesura towards the beginning of the line. This unexpected pause forces the reader to slow down and really take in that line. So there is imagery and meaning in this particular line that the writer really wants to emphasize. Slides like a sea, nor fenced, nor staked, the gushers of the sky spout to the rod, divining in a smile the oil of tears. With this example, we have a line with two pauses, being an initial and then a medial caesura. The line break before this line is end-stopped, and then the line with the two commas is then enjambed to carry on to the next line that has no pauses and is also enjambed. The speaker is balancing the pacing of the poem and skillfully negotiating time with his imagery. Additionally, if the text here had an end stop after sky or rod, it would be cutting up the meaning of the verse, and additionally, it would slow down the energy of the poem too much and would no longer be selectively emphasizing certain expressions. So we've gone over the reason why the writer decided to use alternating line lengths and the effect that it has on the poem, and we've just talked a bit about how to use punctuation and different kinds of line breaks and how that is used in order to create pacing and emphasis. So now we're going to take a closer look at the imagery in the lines and see if we can further determine the reason behind why the lines are constructed in this particular way. So I have both of the poems up on the screen right now. For the altered lines version of the poem, I broke up the lines in a mostly opposite fashion to the original poem, but still ending the lines with a strong image or partial idea. At a first glance, we can see a clear difference in the structure of the lines and the line lengths. The first stanza is able to somewhat keep the appearance of the original poem, but the rest of the lines don't yield that same consistency of energy that the original poem skillfully establishes. When we start to actually read the altered lines poem, we see how much emphasis and feeling is found in those short lines, and the original intention of the poem is obscured by this format. It's not that the quality of the lines are terrible, they just don't feel as intentional. And so there is a meaning lost with this altered version of the poem. On a final note, with the altered lines, we can see how the pacing is completely destroyed. And so there are beautiful moments of verse that are being rushed and shorter lines that are highlighting or emphasizing less important expressions in the poem. So this concludes part 1 of this installment of Root of Ramose, writing the Song of the Line in poetry. So I'll take a moment to recap the main points and takeaways from different segments in this video. So how we phrase ideas and implement punctuation as space has an observable impact on sound, feeling, and meaning in our lines. This is because the choices that we make with line lengths and space controls the speed at which the poem is visually read, and then impacts the pacing of how the images are delivered to the reader. Speed and pacing helps to develop a mood, an emotion, or tone for your poem. If you want your reader to occupy a space of contemplation, have long, spacious lines. If you want to emote anxiety or quickness, short lines can help you achieve that feeling. Of course, there is an endless spectrum to how you could craft the formal structure of your lines. Know that you always have the choice to implement a formal structure that reflects the mood and intention of your subject matter, or that you could use a format that heavily contrasts with the subject matter in order to create a layer of subtext about your subject. Additionally, I just want to let you know that if you are deciding to make strange or jarring structural choices with your poetry, that as long as you understand all of the ways in which those choices branch out to create meaning and emotion in your text, and that the logic that you're using has the same quality of consistency throughout, then you shouldn't worry about what others think of your work. Of course, you need to be open to feedback, take criticism when you can get it, but don't get into the habit of compromising your vision. Only make changes that will strengthen what it is you're trying to express. Ultimately, you have to believe in your own vision. You have to fully understand the choices that you make and what purpose they serve. That's really the best way to insulate yourself from the fear of being perceived by others. So that's all I have for you guys today. Let me know what you found helpful. As I mentioned before, I will be releasing a second part to this particular topic. So if you've enjoyed the information that I've shared today and you've gained something from this video, you can feel welcome to subscribe if you'd like. If you're curious to learn more about me specifically, I do have links in the description that'll go to my different platforms. Today I thought I would just leave you with a quote that I recently found that I really love, and it is by the Russian filmmaker Tarkovsky. "The only thing that an artist can do to be understood is to be sincere."